Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of man who lived life in the background. At 42, he worked as a librarian in a small town in Ohio, spending his days organizing books and helping elderly patrons find romance novels. His world was quiet, predictable, and safe. The most excitement he experienced was when someone returned a book late or when the coffee machine in the break room finally worked properly. But everything changed the day his sister Emma called him with news that would alter the course of his life forever. She had won a photography contest, and the prize was a 2-week trip to London for 2 people. Emma, being a successful marketing executive who traveled frequently for work, had already seen most of Europe. Without hesitation, she offered the second ticket to Marcus. "Come on, Marcus," she had said over the phone, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "When was the last time you did something spontaneous? When was the last time you left Ohio, for that matter?" Marcus stared at his small apartment, filled with books and the same furniture he had owned for 15 years. His cat, Whiskers, looked at him from the windowsill with what seemed like judgment in her green eyes. Even his pets seemed to be telling him to take the leap. The decision wasn't easy. Marcus had always been afraid of flying, afraid of crowds, afraid of being in places where he didn't speak the language perfectly. But something deep inside him, a voice he had ignored for years, whispered that this might be his only chance to see the world beyond his small-town existence. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in Heathrow Airport, clutching his passport like a lifeline. The bustling crowds, the announcements in different languages, and the sheer size of everything overwhelmed him. Emma had to fly separately due to work commitments, so Marcus was completely alone in a foreign country for the first time in his life. The taxi ride through London was a blur of red buses, black cabs, and historic buildings that seemed to rise from the pages of the history books he had read countless times. His hotel was modest but clean, located just a short walk from many of the city's famous landmarks. That first night, Marcus barely slept, partly due to jet lag and partly due to the excitement and terror of being so far from home. The next morning, armed with a guidebook, a map, and a determination to make the most of his trip, Marcus set out to explore London. He visited the Tower of London, walked across the Thames on various bridges, and even managed to navigate the underground system without getting completely lost. Each day, his confidence grew a little more. It was on his 5th day in London that Marcus decided to visit Buckingham Palace. He had saved this particular attraction for when he felt more comfortable navigating the city. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything look like it belonged in a postcard. As he approached the palace, Marcus was struck by its grandeur. The building seemed to stretch endlessly, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Tourists from around the world gathered around the iron gates, taking photos and chattering in dozens of different languages. Street performers entertained the crowds, and vendors sold Union Jack souvenirs and postcards. Marcus found a spot near the gates and pulled out his small digital camera, the same one he had owned for nearly a decade. He wasn't much of a photographer, but he wanted to capture this moment, this proof that quiet Marcus Thompson from Ohio had actually made it to one of the most famous palaces in the world. As he was adjusting the camera settings, trying to figure out how to get the best shot of the palace, he noticed the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Tourists pushed closer to the gates, and Marcus found himself swept along with the crowd. The guards emerged in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, their movements precise and synchronized. Marcus watched in fascination as they marched with perfect timing, their faces serious and focused. The ceremony was both beautiful and somewhat intimidating, a display of tradition that had been carried out for centuries. One guard in particular caught Marcus's attention. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with sharp features and an incredibly stoic expression. He stood perfectly still at his post, his rifle at his side, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Marcus found himself admiring the discipline it must take to stand so motionless, especially with hundreds of tourists taking pictures and making noise just a few feet away. As the formal ceremony concluded and most of the crowd began to disperse, Marcus remained near the gates. He was still fascinated by the guards who remained at their posts. The young guard he had noticed earlier was now stationed directly in front of where Marcus stood. Marcus raised his camera again, wanting to capture a photo of the guard in his impressive uniform. Through his viewfinder, he could see the details of the red tunic, the golden buttons, and the serious expression on the young man's face. But, as he was about to take the photo, something unexpected happened. A gust of wind blew through the area, and Marcus watched in horror as his baseball cap, the one memento he had brought from home, was lifted from his head and carried toward the guard's post. The cap, faded blue with the logo of his local library, flew through the air and landed directly at the feet of the motionless guard. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He looked around at the other tourists, hoping someone might know the proper protocol for retrieving a hat from near a royal guard. But everyone seemed just as uncertain as he was. Some people were already taking pictures of the situation, finding humor in the American tourist's predicament. The guard, true to his training, did not move. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and his expression didn't change even slightly. The cap sat there on the ground, looking small and out of place against the backdrop of centuries-old tradition and formality. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment. He could hear whispers and chuckles from the crowd behind him. A family with small children had stopped to watch what would happen next. An elderly British couple shook their heads disapprovingly, as if Marcus had deliberately caused this disruption. "Just leave it," someone behind him suggested. "It's just a hat." But it wasn't just a hat to Marcus. That cap had been a gift from his co-workers when he had received a small promotion at the library. It represented one of the few times in his life that he had felt recognized and appreciated. More than that, it was his connection to home, his security blanket in this foreign place. Marcus looked at the guard again, searching for any sign of what he should do. The young man's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a barely perceptible awareness of the situation. Marcus could tell that the guard was very much aware of the hat at his feet and the growing crowd of onlookers. Taking a deep breath, Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct he had about following rules and avoiding attention. He stepped forward, closer to the guard post than any tourist was supposed to go. The murmur of the crowd behind him grew louder, and he heard someone say, "What is that American doing?" "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt ridiculous talking to someone who was trained not to respond, but he couldn't think of what else to do. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know you can't move or talk, but that's my hat. It blew off my head, and I was wondering if there's any way I could get it back." The guard said nothing, of course. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes still focused straight ahead. But Marcus thought he saw something flicker across the young man's face, perhaps a brief moment of sympathy or understanding. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, feeling more foolish by the second. The crowd behind him was growing larger, and he could see people holding up their phones, recording this awkward interaction. He imagined his embarrassing moment going viral on social media, the shy librarian from Ohio who broke royal protocol for a baseball cap. Just as Marcus was about to give up and walk away, accepting the loss of his hat as the price of his clumsiness, something unexpected happened. The guard, while maintaining his rigid posture and forward gaze, shifted his foot slightly. It was the smallest possible movement, barely noticeable unless someone was watching very carefully. But the movement was just enough to push the cap a few inches closer to Marcus. Marcus blinked, uncertain if he had imagined it. But there was the hat, definitely closer than it had been a moment before. He looked up at the guard's face, but the young man's expression remained completely neutral. If he had moved his foot intentionally, he gave no sign of it. Encouraged by this small gesture, Marcus crouched down and quickly retrieved his hat. As he stood up, he found himself face to face with the guard, close enough to see the individual threads in his red uniform and the careful way his hair was styled beneath his tall hat. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, even though he wasn't entirely sure the movement had been intentional. "Thank you so much." For just a moment, the briefest instant, Marcus thought he saw the corner of the guard's mouth twitch upward in what might have been a smile. But it happened so quickly that Marcus couldn't be sure if he had imagined it. As Marcus stepped back from the guard post, placing his rescued hat firmly on his head, the crowd behind him erupted in quiet applause and laughter. An elderly woman patted him on the shoulder and said, "Well done, love. That was quite brave of you." Marcus felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and pride. He had broken protocol, drawn attention to himself, and potentially gotten a royal guard in trouble. But he had also stood up for something that mattered to him, and, in some small way, he felt like he had connected with another human being across the barriers of duty and tradition. As he walked away from the palace gates, Marcus found himself thinking about the guard. What was his name? Where was he from? Did he have family who worried about him standing motionless for hours in all kinds of weather? Did he enjoy his job, or was it simply a duty he performed? Marcus spent the rest of that day exploring London with a new sense of confidence. The incident at the palace had shown him that he could handle unexpected situations, that he could speak up for himself when necessary. He visited museums, tried foods he had never heard of, and even struck up conversations with other tourists. That evening, back in his hotel room, Marcus called Emma to tell her about his day. When he described the incident with the guard, Emma laughed and said, "Only you, Marcus, would find a way to have a personal moment with someone who's trained not to have personal moments." But, as Marcus lay in bed that night, he realized that Emma was right, and that maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe his quiet, thoughtful nature allowed him to notice things that other people missed. Maybe his sensitivity to others' situations was actually a strength, not a weakness. The next morning, Marcus found himself drawn back to Buckingham Palace. He told himself he was just going to walk by, perhaps take a few more photos in better light. But, deep down, he knew he was hoping to see the same guard again. When he arrived at the palace gates, he was disappointed to see that the guards had changed. The young man who had helped him retrieve his hat was nowhere to be seen. Marcus stood there for a while, watching the new guards at their posts, but it wasn't the same. As he was about to leave, an older man in a maintenance uniform approached him. "You're the American from yesterday, aren't you?" the man asked with a friendly smile. "The one with the hat?" Marcus nodded, feeling his face flush with embarrassment. "Yes, that was me. I hope I didn't get anyone in trouble." The maintenance worker chuckled. "Trouble? Son, you gave us the best story we've heard in months. The lad you met yesterday, James, he's been talking about it ever since his shift ended. Said it was the most interesting thing that's happened to him since he started this job." "James?" Marcus repeated, surprised to learn the guard's name. James Morrison. "Good lad, been with us for about 2 years now." "Between you and me," the man leaned in conspiratorially, "he was quite impressed with how respectfully you handled the situation. Most tourists would have just grabbed their hat and run, or made a big scene about it. But you asked permission, even though you knew he couldn't answer." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. The idea that his small act of courtesy had been noticed and appreciated meant more to him than he could express. "Will I see him again?" Marcus asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. "He's got the morning shift tomorrow," the maintenance worker said with a knowing smile. "Usually arrives about an hour before the ceremony to prepare. Might be around the side entrance if you're interested in a proper conversation." Marcus thanked the man and walked away, his mind racing. He had never been the type of person to seek out social interactions, especially with strangers. But something about his brief encounter with James had stirred something in him, a curiosity about the person behind the uniform. That afternoon, Marcus visited the British Museum, but he found it difficult to concentrate on the ancient artifacts and historical displays. His mind kept drifting back to the young guard and the kindness he had shown. Marcus had traveled thousands of miles from home, but the most meaningful moment of his trip had been a silent interaction that lasted less than a minute. As evening approached, Marcus made his way back to his hotel through the bustling streets of London. The city was beginning to feel less foreign and more like a place where interesting things could happen. He passed pubs filled with people laughing and talking, street musicians entertaining passers-by, and couples walking hand in hand along the Thames. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was part of something larger than his quiet life in Ohio. He was experiencing the world not just as an observer, but as a participant. The shy librarian who had been afraid to leave his hometown was discovering that he had the courage to connect with people, even in the most unlikely circumstances. That night, as Marcus prepared for bed, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would return to the palace, not as a tourist hoping for a glimpse of royalty, but as one person hoping to properly thank another person for a simple act of kindness. It was a small step, but, for Marcus, it felt like the beginning of a much larger journey. Marcus woke up earlier than usual the next morning, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he would say to James, rehearsing different conversations in his mind. Now, in the cold light of dawn, his plan seemed foolish and presumptuous. What if James didn't want to talk to him? What if approaching a guard off-duty was somehow inappropriate or even illegal? Despite his doubts, Marcus found himself getting dressed and heading toward Buckingham Palace before the sun had fully risen. The streets of London were quieter at this hour, with only early commuters and delivery trucks sharing the roads with the occasional tourist like himself. When he reached the palace area, Marcus wasn't entirely sure where the side entrance the maintenance worker had mentioned might be. He walked around the perimeter of the palace grounds, feeling increasingly foolish with each step. What was he doing? He was a middle-aged librarian from Ohio, not someone who sought out adventures or struck up friendships with strangers in foreign countries. Just as he was about to give up and return to his hotel for breakfast, Marcus spotted a smaller gate about 100 yards from the main entrance. Several people in various uniforms were entering and leaving through this gate, and Marcus realized this must be where the staff accessed the palace grounds. He positioned himself across the street, trying to look casual while keeping an eye on everyone who passed through the gate. An hour passed, then another. Marcus began to worry that he had misunderstood the maintenance workers' directions, or that James had been reassigned to a different shift. Then, at exactly 7:30, Marcus saw him. James was walking toward the side gate, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a dark jacket, carrying what appeared to be a gym bag. Even without his elaborate uniform, Marcus recognized him immediately. There was something about his posture and the way he carried himself that was unmistakable. Marcus's heart began to race. This was his chance, but suddenly, he had no idea what to do with it. Should he call out? Should he cross the street and introduce himself? Should he pretend this was all a coincidence? Before he could decide on a course of action, James looked up and their eyes met across the street. For a moment, both men stood perfectly still, recognition dawning on James's face. Then, to Marcus's surprise and relief, James smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire appearance. James looked both ways and crossed the street toward Marcus. "You're the American with the hat," he said, his accent crisp and distinctly British. "I was hoping I might see you again." "You were?" Marcus asked, unable to hide his surprise. "Of course. It's not every day someone treats me like a human being while I'm on duty," James replied with a laugh. "Most tourists seem to think we're just part of the scenery, like living statues or something." Marcus felt relief wash over him. "I wasn't sure if I should bother you. I don't really know the protocol for this sort of thing." "There isn't any protocol," James assured him. "When I'm off duty, I'm just James Morrison from Manchester, not a member of Her Majesty's Guard. Would you like to grab a coffee? I've got about 45 minutes before I need to be in uniform." Marcus nodded eagerly, and James led him to a small cafe just around the corner from the palace. It was the kind of place that clearly catered to locals rather than tourists, simple, unpretentious, with newspapers scattered on tables and the smell of bacon and eggs filling the air. They found a table by the window, and James ordered a full English breakfast while Marcus opted for coffee and toast. As they waited for their food, an awkward silence settled between them. Marcus realized he had been so focused on finding James that he hadn't really thought about what they would talk about once they met. "So," James said finally, "what brings you to London?" "Besides rescuing hats from palace grounds, I mean." Marcus told him about Emma's contest win and his decision to take the trip despite his usual reluctance to travel. As he talked, he found himself being more open than he typically was with strangers. There was something about James's easy manner and genuine interest that made Marcus feel comfortable. "A librarian," James said when Marcus mentioned his job. "That's brilliant. I've always loved books, but I never had much time for reading once I joined the army." "The army?" Marcus asked. Yes, I did 2 tours in Afghanistan before taking this position, James explained. The guard duty is actually a pretty sought-after assignment. Good pay, stable hours, and you get to be part of something with real history and tradition. Marcus found himself fascinated by James's background. Here was someone only 20 years younger than himself who had already seen combat, traveled the world, and now performed one of the most recognizable ceremonial duties in the British military. What was Afghanistan like? Marcus asked, then, immediately worried he might be overstepping. I'm sorry, you probably don't want to talk about that. It's all right, James said, though his expression became more serious. It was complicated. Dangerous, obviously, but also important. We were trying to help people, to make a difference. Some days we succeeded, some days we didn't. It changes you, being in a place like that. Marcus could hear something in James's voice, a weight that hadn't been there when they were discussing books and travel. He realized that this young man had experienced things that Marcus, for all his reading and imagination, could never fully understand. Is that why you became a guard? Marcus asked. For the stability after everything you'd been through? James considered this question carefully. Partly, yes. But also because I wanted to do something that honored the service, you know? Something that connected me to the history and traditions of the country I'd been fighting for. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food. As they ate, James asked Marcus about his life in Ohio, about the library, about what it was like to live in a small town. Marcus found himself describing his daily routine, his small apartment, his cat whiskers, and even his occasional loneliness. It sounds peaceful, James said. After some of the places I've been, peaceful sounds pretty wonderful. Sometimes too peaceful, Marcus admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm just watching life happen instead of actually living it. But, you're here now, James pointed out. That's not watching from the sidelines. That's jumping in with both feet. As they finished their meal, James checked his watch. I need to head back soon, but I'm curious about something. Why did you come back today? I mean, you got your hat back, you had your London experience. What made you want to find me? Marcus struggled to articulate his feelings. I guess I wanted to thank you properly. What you did yesterday, it was such a small thing, but it meant a lot to me. I'm not used to people going out of their way to help me, even in little ways. Moving my foot wasn't exactly going out of my way, James said with a smile. It was for you, Marcus replied seriously. I could tell you were taking a risk, even with something that small. You could have gotten in trouble. James was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus's face. You're right, he said finally. I could have. But sometimes you have to choose between following the rules perfectly and being a decent human being. I figured being decent was more important. This simple statement hit Marcus harder than he expected. Here was someone who had made a split-second decision to help a stranger, accepting the potential consequences because it was the right thing to do. Marcus realized he had been thinking about that moment for 2 days, not just because of the kindness, but because of the courage it represented. I have to ask you something, James said as they prepared to leave. Are you planning to stay in London much longer? Another week, Marcus replied. Why? Well, I was thinking. I'm off duty tomorrow evening, and I don't really have any plans. If you'd like, I could show you some parts of London that aren't in the guidebooks. Places where actual Londoners go, instead of just the tourist spots. Marcus felt a surge of excitement followed immediately by his old familiar anxiety. This was exactly the kind of spontaneous, social situation that usually terrified him. But, looking at James's friendly, open face, he realized he didn't want to let fear hold him back anymore. I'd like that very much, Marcus said. They exchanged phone numbers, and James gave Marcus his address. As they parted ways outside the cafe, James heading back toward the palace and Marcus toward his hotel, Marcus felt like something fundamental had shifted in his world. For the rest of that day, Marcus found himself walking through London with new eyes. Instead of just checking famous landmarks off his tourist list, he began to notice the everyday life of the city. He watched commuters hurrying to work, shopkeepers opening their stores, children walking to school with their parents. He began to see London not just as a collection of historic sites, but as a place where real people lived real lives. That evening, Marcus called Emma to tell her about meeting James. She was delighted and impressed by his initiative. "Marcus, you're becoming quite the social butterfly," she teased. "Next thing you know, you'll be backpacking through Europe and staying in hostels." "Let's not get carried away," Marcus laughed, but privately he wondered if Emma might be more right than she knew. The next day passed slowly for Marcus. He visited Westminster Abbey and took a river cruise on the Thames, but he found it difficult to concentrate on sightseeing. He was nervous about his evening with James, running through possible conversations and worrying about whether he would be good company. At 6 o'clock, Marcus stood outside the address James had given him, a modest apartment building in a neighborhood that was clearly residential rather than touristy. He had changed clothes 3 times before leaving his hotel, finally settling on khakis and a button-down shirt that he hoped struck the right balance between casual and respectful. James answered his door dressed in jeans and a sweater, looking relaxed and completely different from the formal guard Marcus had first encountered. His apartment was small but comfortable, with books scattered on tables and military memorabilia displayed on shelves. "Ready for a proper London evening?" James asked with a grin. Their first stop was a pub that James described as his local, a cozy place with dark wood paneling and the kind of atmosphere that could only come from decades of neighborhood conversations. James introduced Marcus to the bartender and several regular customers, all of whom welcomed the American visitor with genuine warmth. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did in social situations. Perhaps it was being in a foreign country where nobody knew his usual reserved persona, or perhaps it was James's easy way of including him in conversations. Whatever the reason, Marcus discovered he could be funny, interesting, and engaging when he allowed himself to be. From the pub, they walked through neighborhoods that guidebooks never mentioned, areas where families lived and worked and went about their daily lives. James pointed out architectural details, told stories about local history, and shared observations about London life that no tour guide could have provided. "This is where I come when I need to remember why I love this city," James said as they stood on a bridge overlooking the Thames at sunset. "It's easy to get caught up in the ceremony and tradition of the palace, to forget that we're protecting something living and breathing, not just a museum." Marcus understood what James meant. The London he was seeing tonight was vibrant and real in a way that the tourist attractions, impressive as they were, could never be. This was a city where people built lives, not just a destination where people came to take photographs. As they walked back toward James's apartment, their conversation turned more personal. James talked about his family in Manchester, his decision to join the army, and his plans for the future. Marcus found himself sharing stories about his childhood, his dreams of traveling that he had never pursued, and his gradual realization that he had been living his life too safely. "There's nothing wrong with safety," James said thoughtfully. "After some of the things I've seen, I have a lot of respect for people who build stable, peaceful lives. But there's a difference between choosing safety and being paralyzed by fear." "How do you tell the difference?" Marcus asked. "I think, if you're choosing safety because it allows you to do things you care about, that's wisdom. If you're choosing safety because you're afraid to find out what you're capable of, that's something else entirely." This conversation stayed with Marcus as they said goodnight outside James's building. As he walked back to his hotel through the London streets, Marcus reflected on James's words. For most of his life, he had chosen safety because he was afraid of failure, afraid of rejection, afraid of discovering that he wasn't as capable or interesting as he hoped he might be. But, over the past few days, he had been discovering things about himself that surprised him. He could navigate a foreign city, strike up friendships with strangers, and handle unexpected situations with grace. Maybe James was right. Maybe he had been underestimating himself for years. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling different. The shy, anxious tourist who had arrived in London a week ago was still there, but he was accompanied now by someone more confident and curious. Marcus realized he still had several days left in London, and he intended to make the most of them. He spent the day exploring areas of the city James had mentioned, using public transportation with growing confidence and even striking up conversations with other travelers. When he got lost trying to find a particular museum, instead of panicking, he asked for directions and ended up having a lovely chat with an elderly woman who invited him to join her for tea. That evening, James called to ask how Marcus's day had gone. They ended up talking for over an hour, sharing stories and observations about London, travel, and life in general. Marcus realized that somewhere along the way, he and James had become genuine friends, despite their different backgrounds and the brief time they had known each other. "I have tomorrow off as well," James said toward the end of their conversation. "There's something I'd like to show you, if you're interested. It's a bit of a trip outside London, but I think you'd appreciate it." "What is it?" Marcus asked. "It's a surprise," James replied. "Trust me on this one. Can you meet me at Victoria Station at 9 in the morning?" Marcus agreed, and, as he hung up the phone, he realized he felt no anxiety about this unknown adventure. The old Marcus would have insisted on knowing exactly where they were going and what they would be doing. But the person he was becoming was content to trust James and see where the day would lead them. Marcus arrived at Victoria Station 10 minutes early, his backpack loaded with water and snacks that he had picked up from a nearby shop. The massive station bustled with commuters and travelers, creating a symphony of announcements, footsteps, and conversations in dozens of languages. He stood near the information board, watching for James among the crowd. When James appeared, he was carrying a larger backpack than Marcus had expected and had a mysterious smile on his face that suggested today's adventure would be something special. "Ready for a proper English countryside experience?" James asked as they approached the ticket counter. "Countryside?" Marcus repeated, realizing he had imagined they might visit another London neighborhood or perhaps a nearby museum. "Trust me," James said, purchasing 2 return tickets. "You came all the way to England, you should see more than just London." Their train pulled out of the station 45 minutes later, carrying them through the gradually changing landscape as urban buildings gave way to green fields and small villages. Marcus pressed his face to the window like a child, fascinated by the patchwork of farms, the ancient stone walls dividing properties, and the occasional castle or manor house rising from the countryside. "Where exactly are we going?" Marcus asked as they settled into their seats. "A place called Salisbury," James replied. "There's something there I think you need to see, especially after our conversation last night about choosing safety versus being paralyzed by fear." The train journey took just over an hour, during which James and Marcus talked about their respective childhoods. Marcus shared stories about growing up in Ohio, his love for books from an early age, and his dream of becoming a writer that he had abandoned in favor of the security of library work. James talked about Manchester, his working-class family, and his decision to join the army despite his parents' concerns. "My mother cried for 3 days when I told her I was enlisting," James said. "She was convinced I was throwing my life away, that I should get a safe job in an office somewhere." "What changed her mind?" Marcus asked. "She saw what the army did for me," James replied. "Not the dangerous parts, obviously, but the confidence it gave me, the sense of purpose. She realized I needed to prove something to myself, and the army was the way I chose to do it." When they arrived in Salisbury, Marcus was charmed by the small city's medieval streets and cathedral spire that dominated the skyline. But James led him away from the main tourist areas, toward the edge of town where a bus was waiting. "One more short trip," James said as they boarded the bus along with a handful of other passengers, most of whom appeared to be tourists with cameras and guidebooks. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself standing in a field, looking at one of the most famous landmarks in the world, Stonehenge. The ancient stone circle rose from the plain like something from a dream, mysterious and imposing despite the crowds of visitors and the modern visitor center nearby. "I don't understand," Marcus said, staring at the monument. "What does this have to do with our conversation about fear and safety?" James smiled and began walking toward the stones. "Come on, I'll explain as we go." They joined the audio tour, walking along the designated path that circled the monument. As they walked, James began to tell Marcus about the history of Stonehenge, how it had been built over thousands of years by people who had no modern technology, no cranes or trucks or power tools. "Think about what it took to build this place," James said as they paused in front of the massive trilithons. "The people who started this project knew they would never see it completed. They were working towards something that would outlast not just their own lives, but their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives. Marcus looked at the enormous stones, some weighing more than 25 tons, and tried to imagine the effort required to transport them and position them with such precision. But here's what really gets me, James continued. These weren't desperate people building something for survival. This was a monument, a place of ceremony or worship or astronomical observation. They chose to spend generations of their lives creating something beautiful and meaningful, even though it was incredibly difficult and dangerous. As they completed the circuit around the stones, Marcus began to understand what James was trying to show him. "You're saying they chose the hard path instead of the safe one," Marcus said. "I'm saying they chose the meaningful path," James corrected. Safety probably would have been staying in their villages, growing enough food to survive, not attempting massive construction projects that required incredible coordination and risk. They found a bench in the visitor center cafe and sat down with cups of tea. Through the large windows, they could still see Stonehenge in the distance, its ancient stones standing against the modern sky. "I've been thinking about what you told me about your writing," James said. "You said you gave it up because being a librarian was safer, more secure." Marcus nodded, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "But what if the people who built Stonehenge had thought that way?" James asked. "What if they had said, 'This is too hard, too risky, let's just focus on getting by day to day'?" "The world would have one less wonder," Marcus admitted. "Exactly. And maybe the world has one less writer because you chose security over passion." Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same feeling he always got when he thought about the stories he had never written, the books that existed only in his imagination. "But writing isn't like building Stonehenge," Marcus protested. "There's no guarantee that anything I write would be good or meaningful or that anyone would want to read it." "There was no guarantee that Stonehenge would work either," James pointed out. "Whatever purpose it was meant to serve, the people who built it had to have faith that their efforts would matter." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching other visitors walk around the monument. Marcus found himself thinking about all the choices he had made in his life, all the times he had chosen the safe path over the unknown one. "I started writing a novel once," Marcus said quietly. "About 10 years ago. It was about a librarian who discovers that some of the books in his library are gateways to other worlds." James leaned forward, interested. "What happened to it?" "I got about 50 pages in and, then, I started thinking about how silly it was, how there were already thousands of fantasy novels and, who was I to think I could write one worth reading? So I stopped." "Do you still have those 50 pages?" "Yes, they're on my computer at home." "Then, maybe it's not too late to finish it." As they prepared to leave Stonehenge, Marcus took one last long look at the ancient monument. He tried to imagine the first person who had proposed building it, tried to envision the conversation where someone had said, "I have an idea for something that seems impossible but might be extraordinary." On the train back to London, Marcus found himself asking James about his future plans. "I'm thinking about leaving the Guard in a few months," James said. "I've been offered a position training new recruits, teaching them about discipline and ceremony. It would be a step up in responsibility, and I think I'd be good at it." "That sounds like a great opportunity," Marcus said. "It is, but it's also scary," James admitted. "Right now, my job is pretty straightforward. Stand still, look impressive, follow orders. Training recruits means being responsible for other people's development, having to make decisions about their futures." Marcus realized that James, despite his confidence and military background, faced the same kinds of fears that Marcus did, just in different contexts. "What made you decide to take the risk?" Marcus asked. "Honestly? Meeting you," James said with a smile. "Watching you step out of your comfort zone, seeing how you've changed just in the few days I've known you. If a shy librarian from Ohio can navigate London and make friends with strange British soldiers, I figure I can handle teaching a few recruits." This comment caught Marcus completely off guard. He had been thinking of James as the confident one, the person who took risks and lived boldly. The idea that his own small acts of courage had inspired James seemed almost impossible to believe. When they arrived back in London, the sun was setting, painting the city in golden light. Instead of heading directly back to their respective homes, they decided to walk along the Thames, continuing their conversation as they watched boats pass on the river. "I want to ask you something," Marcus said as they leaned against the railing of a bridge. "What you did that first day, with my hat, had you ever done anything like that before?" James thought for a moment. "You mean breaking protocol?" "I mean helping a stranger when you could get in trouble for it." "Not exactly like that," James said. "But, in Afghanistan, there were times when you had to choose between following orders exactly and doing what seemed right in the moment. You learn to trust your instincts about people pretty quickly over there." "What did your instincts tell you about me?" James smiled. "That you were someone who would say please and thank you to a person who couldn't respond. That you cared more about being respectful than about getting what you wanted. That you were probably a lot braver than you thought you were." As they walked back through the London streets, Marcus felt like he was seeing the city through different eyes again. The buildings, the people, the very atmosphere seemed charged with possibility. He thought about Stonehenge, about the ancient people who had committed their lives to creating something extraordinary. He thought about James's decision to take a new position despite his fears. And he thought about the novel on his computer at home, waiting for him to decide whether it was worth finishing. That night, Marcus lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the entire day in his mind. The trip to Stonehenge had been much more than a tourist excursion, it had been a revelation. For the first time, Marcus began to see his safe, quiet life not as a virtue but as a limitation he had imposed on himself. He thought about his co-workers at the library, who saw him as reliable and competent but probably had no idea that he dreamed of writing novels. He thought about his small apartment, arranged exactly the way he liked it but empty of the energy that comes from pursuing something challenging and meaningful. He thought about Whiskers, his cat, who seemed content to spend her days sleeping in the same sunny spot by the window. Was contentment enough? Marcus had always thought so, but now he wasn't sure. The next morning, Marcus met James for coffee before James had to report for duty. They had only 2 more days together before Marcus's return flight to Ohio, and both of them seemed to sense that something important was happening in these final moments of their friendship. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Marcus told James as they sat in the same cafe where they had first had breakfast together. "About finishing my novel. And I'm scared," Marcus admitted. "Not just of failing, but of succeeding. What if I write something good? What if people want to read it? That might mean changing my whole life, and I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of change." James nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. When I was offered this new position, my first thought wasn't, what if I fail? It was, what if I succeed? Success can be just as frightening as failure because it means you have to live up to new expectations. So how do you decide?" "I think about what I'll regret more," James said. "Will I regret trying and failing, or will I regret never trying at all?" As Marcus walked back to his hotel after saying goodbye to James, he carried this question with him. He spent the day visiting some of the London attractions he had missed, but his heart wasn't really in sightseeing anymore. His mind was focused on the choice that was forming clearly for the first time in his adult life. He could return to Ohio and resume his comfortable, predictable existence. He could continue working at the library, feeding Whiskers, reading other people's books, and telling himself that he was content with his quiet life. It would be safe and familiar and free from the anxiety that came with pursuing something uncertain. Or he could take the risk of finishing his novel, of putting his dreams to the test. It might lead to rejection and disappointment, but it might also lead to something extraordinary. That evening, Marcus called James to thank him for the trip to Stonehenge and to say goodbye, since they wouldn't see each other again before Marcus's departure. "Thank you for everything," Marcus said. "This week has been transformative, I think." "For me too," James replied. "You've reminded me that courage comes in different forms. You don't have to be a soldier or a guard to be brave. Sometimes the bravest thing is just being willing to be yourself in the world." After he hung up, Marcus sat in his hotel room and opened his laptop. For the first time in years, he opened the document containing those 50 pages of his novel. He read through them slowly, remembering the excitement he had felt while writing them, the sense of possibility and creativity that had driven him to create this story. The writing wasn't perfect, he could see that clearly now, but it was alive with imagination and hope. As he read, Marcus realized that the person who had written these pages was someone he wanted to be again, someone who believed that stories mattered and that he had stories worth telling. He began to type, adding new words to the story for the first time in a decade. The sentences came slowly at first, but, as he found his rhythm, the words began to flow more freely. He wrote about his librarian protagonist discovering a book that glowed with mysterious light, about stepping through a doorway into a world where books themselves were living beings. Marcus wrote until well past midnight, losing himself in the act of creation in a way he hadn't experienced since his college years. When he finally stopped, exhausted but exhilarated, he had added 8 new pages to his novel. As he prepared for bed, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The trip to London had been about much more than seeing famous sights or experiencing a different culture. It had been about discovering that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined, both in terms of courage and creativity. Tomorrow, he would fly back to Ohio, back to his job and his apartment and his familiar routines. But he would not be returning as the same person who had left. The shy, careful librarian would always be part of him, but now he was accompanied by someone who believed in the possibility of extraordinary things, someone who was ready to build his own version of Stonehenge, one page at a time. The flight back to Ohio felt different from the journey to London. Where Marcus had been nervous and uncertain on the way there, clutching his armrests during takeoff and worrying about every aspect of international travel, he now found himself calm and reflective. The man in seat 14B was not the same person who had occupied seat 14B 2 weeks earlier. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Cleveland, Marcus could see the familiar landscape of his home state spreading out below him. The neat grid of farm fields, the suburban neighborhoods, the highways he had driven countless times, it all looked smaller somehow, more manageable than it had when he left. Emma was waiting for him at the baggage claim, her face bright with curiosity and excitement. "Well," she said, hugging him tightly. "How was it?" "You look different." Marcus laughed as he retrieved his suitcase from the carousel. "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. More confident, maybe? Like you've got a secret or something." As they drove back toward Marcus's apartment, he told Emma about his adventures, meeting James, exploring neighborhoods that weren't in guidebooks, visiting Stonehenge, and, most importantly, starting to write again. "You're writing again?" Emma asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Marcus, that's wonderful. What made you start?" Marcus thought about how to answer that question. "I met someone who helped me realize that playing it safe isn't always the same thing as being wise. That sometimes the things we're most afraid of are the things we most need to do." When they reached his apartment building, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. The familiar brick facade, the small lobby with its worn carpet, the elevator that creaked as it climbed to the 3rd floor, everything was exactly as he had left it. But, somehow, it felt like he was seeing it all for the first time. Inside his apartment, Whiskers greeted him with typical feline indifference, rubbing against his legs briefly before returning to her favorite spot by the window. Marcus set down his suitcase and looked around at his living space, the carefully organized bookshelves, the comfortable but aging furniture, the photographs of his parents and Emma scattered on various surfaces. It was still home, but it no longer felt like a hiding place. That first night back, Marcus opened his laptop and read through the pages he had written in the London hotel. In the familiar surroundings of his own apartment, the words seemed even more significant. He had actually done it, he had started writing again, not because he had to or because someone was making him, but because he wanted to, because he had remembered what it felt like to create something from nothing. Over the next few days, Marcus settled back into his routine at the library. His co-workers welcomed him back and asked polite questions about his trip. He found himself sharing stories about London, about the museums and landmarks he had visited, but he kept the most important parts, his friendship with James, his revelation at Stonehenge, his decision to write again, private. These felt too precious to share casually. But people noticed changes in him anyway. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly regular who came in every Tuesday to check out romance novels, commented that he seemed livelier than before his trip. Tom, one of his younger colleagues, mentioned that Marcus seemed more willing to engage in conversation and less likely to retreat to his office when the library got busy. Most significantly, Marcus found himself approaching his work differently. Instead of just processing returned books and helping patrons find what they were looking for, he began to really listen to people's requests. When a teenager came in looking for something exciting but not too scary, Marcus spent 20 minutes talking with her about different genres and authors, ultimately helping her discover a fantasy series that sparked a love of reading that would last years. When an elderly man mentioned that he was trying to research his family's immigration history, Marcus didn't just point him toward the genealogy section. He sat down with the man, helped him navigate online databases, and even suggested additional resources at the Historical Society. By the time they finished, Marcus had helped solve a family mystery that had puzzled 3 generations. These interactions reminded Marcus why he had originally been drawn to library work. It wasn't just about organizing information, it was about connecting people with the knowledge and stories they needed to enrich their lives. Every evening after work, Marcus would come home, have dinner, and then open his laptop to work on his novel. Some nights, he would write only a few sentences. Other nights, the words would pour out of him as if they had been waiting years for release. Slowly but steadily, the story grew. His protagonist, the librarian named David Hartley, was discovering that the mysterious books in his library were not just gateways to other worlds, but windows into the deepest desires and fears of the people who read them. Each book David opened revealed something profound about human nature, about the stories people told themselves to make sense of their lives. As Marcus developed David's character, he realized he was writing about his own journey of self-discovery. David's cautious nature, his tendency to observe rather than participate, his gradual awakening to the possibility of adventure, these were all aspects of Marcus's own personality and transformation. 3 weeks after his return from London, Marcus received an email that made his heart skip a beat. It was from James, with the subject line "Greetings from Manchester." The email was warm and friendly, full of updates about James's life. He had indeed taken the position training new recruits and was enjoying the challenge of teaching and mentoring. He had also visited his parents in Manchester and told them about his American friend who had helped him see familiar places with new eyes. "I've been thinking about our conversation at Stonehenge," James wrote. "You asked me once how I knew when to break protocol and when to follow rules. I think I'm beginning to understand that the answer isn't about the rules themselves, but about the kind of person you want to be when faced with a choice between safety and significance." The email continued, "I hope you've continued writing. I keep imagining you in that library, surrounded by all those stories, finally adding your own to the collection. There's something poetic about that, the quiet guardian of stories becoming a storyteller himself." Marcus read the email 3 times before responding. He told James about settling back into life in Ohio, about the changes he was noticing in himself, and about the progress on his novel. As he wrote, he realized how much James's friendship had meant to him, how a chance encounter with a stranger had fundamentally altered his understanding of himself and his possibilities. Over the following months, Marcus and James maintained a regular correspondence. Their emails became a lifeline for both men, James sharing the challenges and rewards of his new position, Marcus describing his writing process and the small adventures he was allowing himself in his daily life. Marcus began to venture beyond his usual routines in ways that would have been unimaginable before his trip to London. He started attending the monthly poetry readings at a local bookstore, initially just as an observer but eventually working up the courage to share one of his own poems. He joined a hiking group that explored the trails around Ohio's state parks, discovering natural beauty that had been within driving distance his entire life but that he had never bothered to seek out. Most significantly, he began sharing his novel with other people. First, he showed a few chapters to Emma, who was so enthusiastic about the story that she insisted he let her share it with her book club. The women in Emma's book club not only enjoyed what Marcus had written but offered thoughtful feedback and encouragement that helped him improve his writing. Encouraged by this response, Marcus joined an online writing community where he could share chapters of his work and receive critiques from other aspiring authors. The feedback was sometimes challenging, but it was also invaluable in helping him develop his skills and confidence as a writer. As winter turned to spring, Marcus made a decision that would have terrified the person he had been a year earlier. He submitted the first 3 chapters of his novel to a small literary contest. The contest was for unpublished works, and, while the prize wasn't large, winning would mean publication in a respected literary magazine. The night he submitted his entry, Marcus lay awake thinking about all the ways his life had changed since that moment when his hat blew off in front of Buckingham Palace. He thought about James, standing motionless in his red uniform, faced with a choice between strict protocol and human kindness. He thought about the ancient builders of Stonehenge, committing their lives to something they might never see completed. He thought about himself, typing words into his laptop late at night, building his own monument to possibility and hope. 3 months later, Marcus received another email that would change his life. This one was from the literary magazine, informing him that his entry had won second place in the contest. His story would be published in their autumn issue, and the editors were interested in seeing more of his work. Marcus read the email 5 times before it fully sank in. Then, he called Emma, who screamed with excitement so loudly that he had to hold the phone away from his ear. After that, he sat down and wrote a long email to James, sharing the news and expressing his gratitude for everything that had led to this moment. James's response came within hours. "I always knew you had extraordinary things in you, Marcus. You just needed to give yourself permission to let them out." That autumn, when Marcus's story was published, he held the magazine in his hands and marveled at seeing his name in print. The story was an excerpt from his novel, a scene where David Hartley first discovers the magical properties of the books in his library. But Marcus knew that the real magic had happened not on the page, but in the transformation of a shy librarian who had learned to believe in his own capacity for courage and creativity. The publication led to other opportunities. An agent contacted him about representing his completed novel. A local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about the hometown writer who had found international inspiration. The library where Marcus worked organized a reading to celebrate their employees' success, and Marcus found himself standing in front of a crowd, sharing his words with confidence he never knew he possessed. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in another email from James, sent on the anniversary of their first meeting. Along with his usual updates about life and work, James included a confession that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. "I need to tell you something," James wrote. "That day when your hat blew toward my post, I was having the worst day I'd had since starting this job. I was questioning everything, why I'd taken the position, whether I was cut out for the discipline it required, whether I'd made a terrible mistake leaving the army. I was standing there feeling completely isolated and wondering if anyone saw me as anything more than a tourist attraction. And then, this American with kind eyes and a respectful voice asked permission to retrieve his hat, said please and thank you to someone who couldn't respond, and reminded me that even in the most formal circumstances, we're still human beings with the capacity to help each other. Your hat blowing away wasn't just a problem for you to solve, Marcus. It was exactly what I needed to remember why I chose this path, why ceremony and tradition matter, and why sometimes the most important thing you can do is make a small gesture of kindness to a stranger. You changed my life just as much as I changed yours." Marcus sat in his apartment, reading these words as whiskers purred on his lap and the late afternoon sun streamed through his windows. Outside, the familiar streets of his Ohio neighborhood stretched away toward horizons that no longer seemed limiting but full of possibility. He thought about the novel he had just finished, about the agent who wanted to represent it, about the readings and workshops he now attended regularly. He thought about the hiking group that had become a source of genuine friendship, about the poetry nights where he had found his voice, about all the small adventures that had grown from one moment of courage in front of a palace gate. Most of all, he thought about James, somewhere in England, training young soldiers and probably inspiring them with the same quiet wisdom and unexpected kindness that had transformed Marcus's understanding of what it meant to be brave. Marcus opened his laptop and began typing a response to James's email, but found himself starting something else instead, the first page of a new story. This one would be about 2 men from different worlds who meet by chance and discover that sometimes the most profound connections happen in the most unlikely circumstances. It would be about the courage to step outside your assigned role, about the power of small kindnesses, and about the way a single moment of genuine human connection can ripple outward to change everything. As he wrote, Marcus smiled, remembering the shy tourist who had once stood frozen with embarrassment as his hat blew toward a motionless guard. That person was still part of him, but he was no longer the whole story. Now Marcus was the author of his own life, building something meaningful and lasting, one word at a time. Outside his window, the Ohio evening settled into night, but Marcus kept writing, adding his own light to the darkness, constructing his own version of something extraordinary.